Good day to you, friends. Well, spring is upon us, so I thought this might be a good opportunity to talk about nature. You know, the birds and the bees, and the sycamore trees, and the spiders and the fleas, if you please. But obviously, as is my wont, I'm not going to be talking about the birds and the bees. I'm going to be talking about the idea of nature itself, the concept of nature, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and how that applies to any of us at all. When we moderns think of nature, we think perhaps first of, say, a hike in the woods, enjoying the beauty of the natural world. If we reflect on the concept a little bit, we might come to the notion of Mother Nature, with all of her nourishing and her ruthlessness, the splendid variety of her forms. If we delve a little bit into the idea of the natural world, we might come to think of wildlife, the animals that live amongst and around us, the wonder and the irrepressible multiplicity of it, its cruelty. Because our idea of nature is profoundly two-sided, it is ambiguous at its root. It includes something beautiful and it includes something merciless and terrible. Our idea of nature is also all-inclusive, or almost all-inclusive. Nature includes most everything around us. But there are two possible exceptions to this, two things that are excluded from the category of nature. One of these might be the dead or inorganic world, and the other might be the human world. But that aside for a moment, this broadly inclusive idea of nature is actually inherently modern. It is a consequence of one of our modern linguistic tendencies. As I discussed in my last video on culture, the modern mindset has a great deal of difficulty with exceptional language, and particularly language which establishes hierarchical distinctions between things or people. It tends consistently to ignore or to alter words that have this kind of an implication. Thus, words like nobility, honor, virtue, civilization, words that establish meaningful, judicious distinctions between human beings or human groups, tend to fall out of favor. We in our democratic day tend to just stop using them. When's the last time, for example, that you heard a public figure referred to as noble, or a person lauded for his virtue, or a man who took some noteworthy public act to defend his honor in some way? Or the word civilization being used in anything but a strictly historical or ironic tone. This sort of thing happens even today, but it's rare, though admittedly it does seem to be making a welcome comeback in some circles. Other words, meanwhile, which are harder to simply ignore, words like culture, art, creation, and nature, are generalized as widely as they possibly can be in order to dilute the harshness of the value judgments that they necessarily contain. And so, as I discussed in my video on culture, culture comes to signify merely any set of customs or habits of any human group, from the most complex modern society all the way down to the local book club. And similarly, the word art nowadays covers everything from Rembrandt to Rublev to Picasso to Pollack, from Henry James to the average second-rate hobby novelist, everything from Bach to Britney Spears, and all the way down to the work of common craftsmen, the doodlings of children, and the clumsy imitations of chimpanzees. Now, to be fair, many of these uses of the word art actually form some of the distinctive battle lines in the contemporary culture war, if I can use that word culture in yet another inappropriate way. Endless arguments are carried out online and elsewhere about whether a jewel-encrusted skull or the latest regurgitation of an artificial intelligence program are really art at all. But this kind of debate is more a symptom of our confusion than anything else. Healthier and more lucid times did not have to debate such things, because the question itself was never posed. It wasn't contemplated, it didn't arise. And similarly to culture and art, the idea of nature has been forced to its widest possible acceptation. It has been made to include as much as it possibly can in order to avoid the implications that are inherent to the older idea of nature. We push so far that sometimes the word nature even seems to want to merge with the idea of the universe itself, and to include everything everywhere. One sees this particularly in certain works of the 19th or earlier 20th century, where nature is spoken of almost with a kind of reverence. Generally, the word is given the capital N in these cases. But, as I pointed out before, there are certain parts of existence that can only dubiously be included under the umbrella of nature, in the way that we presently use the word. And I'll have more to say about that momentarily. But first, I think it would be useful, and indeed probably necessary, to contrast our contemporary use of this word with the ancient use of the word. The idea of nature itself first arose in ancient Greece. The ancient Greek word for nature, physis, was contrasted by the philosophers with the idea of nomos, meaning custom or law or habit or way. Now, physis originally meant something like an appearing or a sprouting forth. It's connected, for instance, to the activity of plants breaking through the soil. It suggests things that arise spontaneously, and by an internal, indeed eternal necessity, as against the arbitrariness which is necessarily implied by merely human standards or opinions. Physis, nature, thus establishes a perennial, unmovable standard, as against the ephemeral, moving standard, which is common to human societies. Human custom is relative. It changes from society to society and from historical epoch to historical epoch. Different societies, different historical periods often express radically different values, consuetudes, and mores. Some societies burn their dead, some societies bury them. Some are monogamous, some are polygamous. Some value the lives of children, and some leave babies to die on hillsides. The fact that customs are relative to different societies is very far from being a modern discovery, however much we often like to act as if it were. The relativity of human custom is even the precondition for philosophy. Philosophy emerges the moment that the special ways of one's particular homeland or city are contrasted against the visibly divergent ways of other lands, other cities. This realization that different peoples, different human groups, have irreconcilable differences in their customs and in their laws and in their ways of doing things arose in ancient Greece in figures like Herodotus. Herodotus, who even wrote that custom, nomos, is king. And it was this realization that opened the way for a philosophical search for the standard, a standard that would not change from place to place or time to time, a standard which was not conditional on the whims of historical accident or variations of geography and law. The realization that human custom is relative does not lead the mind to moral relativism. It rather opens the question of how to overcome the relativity of customs and ways. It leads us, that is to say, to the precise opposite of moral relativism. Now, our specific word, nature, comes not from the Greek, but from the Latin, and in particular from the Latin translation of the Greek physis. The Latin word was natura, and this originally indicates something born, something that is generated. Again, suggesting a kind of spontaneous coming forth. Now, the Latin word natura carried within it the Old Greek sense, and it came in turn into English as our common English word nature. The English word nature originally bore these same ancient connotations, and we can still glimpse this to some extent when we speak of the nature of a human being, or the nature of a thing, or an object, or an animal, although this has to be qualified, and we'll get to that shortly. But because of the modern deterioration of the word nature, it's difficult to find a contemporary word which actually means anything like the Greek physis or the Latin natura. The comparatively recent word phenomenon probably comes closest. Phenomenon also seems to suggest a pouring forth or a springing up or the appearance of something irrevocable and unchangeable, something that is simply given to us whether we will or not. But phenomenon is another universal word. Everything can be taken as a phenomenon, even human customs. So the Greek word physis differs from phenomenon because the Greek word physis is restrictive and exclusive in a way that phenomenon is not. On the other hand, and very interestingly, the Greek word physis itself makes somewhat fitting reappearance in our contemporary language in our word physics. Physics, of course, is the study of the deepest laws that govern the world. And so we often call these the natural laws. But these laws are strictly, to use again the modern word, physical in nature. They extend to the whole of the cosmos, they underpin all of its parts, but they are strictly neutral in terms of value, purpose, meaning, or goals and ends. They have no connection, no consequence for the way that we live our lives, except in the most obvious sense that we can't go flapping about and flying away, or expect to drink poison and survive, things like that. They certainly don't tell us how we should live. You cannot infer from the law of gravity or the laws which bind the different parts of the atoms together anything about the way that a human being should live his life. The physical laws are valueless. They cannot be taken to imply value. Our most advanced and specific theories and formula for the physical laws of the universe cannot in any way answer the question of how a human being should live or how we should order our societies. They do not give us a bedrock against the shifting sands of mere custom. So the original concept of nature, physis, is obscured and even lost in modernity. And we, in consequence, are cast back into the sea of moral relativism. But, and this is absolutely essential to grasp, our modern relativism is not owing so much to a specifically modern epiphany about the world, as it is to a specifically modern forgetfulness about an ancient epiphany. It is the consequence of our growing not more aware than our forebears, but less wise than they were. But, as often happens, the various vicissitudes of human thought give rise to new ideas, new concepts, new inevitabilities of mind and heart. And if the ancient idea of physis cannot be adequately translated into any modern language, so the modern idea of nature cannot be back-translated into any of the ancient languages. The ancient Greek kosmos, meaning something like an ordered whole, from which we take our word cosmos, comes closest to encapsulating our idea of nature. Similarly, the Latin word universus, from which we take universe. But the order of the cosmos, or the universus, was taken to have definite ramifications for human life as such. It had ramifications for the right way of living and the right socio-political order. And the same certainly cannot be said, at least usually, about our idea of nature. And even when it can be, it's definitely in a very different way. We might say in a certain interesting way that The word cosmos was originally a political idea, understanding politics in an older sense, while nature is about as thoroughly unpolitical as they come. This connection to politics, or to the city, to the polis, exists because of the order inherent to the idea of cosmos. The cosmos does not have any intrinsic connection to ideas like the wild, the chaotic, the violent, the arbitrary. To the contrary, cosmos was actually even the precise opposite of chaos. Nature, meanwhile, is very deeply connected to the idea of the wild, specifically the wilderness, the wildness of the organic world. And there is an element of chaos concealed in this. It's not identical to chaos, it seems to be like an ordered chaos in a certain way, but it's there somehow. So our idea of nature is actually something new, something specific to us and to our historical moment. It is the fruit of a specifically secular, democratic, scientific, non-philosophical approach to the study of the world. So let's break this down a bit. As noted before, nature, in its commonest present-day uses, suggests a large segment of the world rather than the whole of the world. And as noted, it excludes in particular two specific parts of the world, the non-organic on the one hand, and the human on the other. The first division is a bit tenuous. We do speak of natural laws which govern the whole of the universe. And certain very remote places like the bottom of the ocean or inhospitable deserts could easily be considered a part of nature. But still, nature seems to be connected in some way to our planet Earth, and this seems to be related to the connection between nature and the organic world, the world of life. Phrases like natural laws seem rather to be a relic of an older use of this word. Very few people would tend to consider, say, flight in a spaceship to outer space, or a stroll on the moon or on Mars, to be an immersion in nature in the same way as, say, a walk in the woods. Nature, as the word is conventionally used, implicates the presence of life, and specifically of wildlife, another interesting term. This is what we call the natural world, which is itself a fascinating collocation, as if there were more than a single world within the world. Worlds within worlds within worlds. And this natural world seems to be contrasted not specifically with the non-organic world, so much as with the human world. Now, this division between the natural world and the human world is of momentous import. The ancients would never have understood this division. It bears only passing resemblance with the distinction between physis and nomos, between nature and custom, because one can speak in ancient Greek of the customs of, say, animals, or the customs even of things. This is a very ancient way of speaking in ancient Greek. One cannot, meanwhile, speak of the human in a squirrel in the woods, the humanity of a wood mouse. Unless, of course, one is reading Redwall. That was a great old series, wasn't it, Redwall? Great. Now, this distinction does not come without its problems. There is a profound tension in our modern views. We want very much to regard man as just one of the animals, and in a different way than the ancients did. Man to us is not so much the social animal as he is a primate, a particularly sophisticated primate. A primate who drinks tea, wages war, and combs his hair. A primate who builds cars, writes poetry, and cages other primates for his investigation and delectation. But a primate nonetheless. Yet, despite our insistence on the fact that man is an animal, the works of man, by our understanding, are in some way unnatural. A building, a robot, a book are not the work of nature, but of man. A social organization or hierarchy is perhaps a bit more ambiguous. Is society itself the work of man, or is it the work of nature? Well, to our common view, that's complicated. One is tempted to say,
a little from column A, a little from column B.
Now, this contrast between the works of nature and the works of man goes back to the earliest moments in our modern period. Montaigne, for instance, speaks very frequently of nature, almost as of an intentioned being. And although his phrasing is, of course, much more elegant than ours, he writes things that would appear to be characteristic of our contemporary view. For instance, in his essay On Experience, he says, nature herself goes against justice in most of her works. Or again, in his essay On Physiognomy, he remarked of Socrates that nature did him an injustice by making him ugly. But he also praises nature far in excess of human art. He considers human art to be but a pale imitation of what nature is capable of, one that falls continually short of attaining her mastery, her economy of means. Now, we of today have moved, we believe, beyond this view. We rather tend to consider art as a solution to nature's problems, a remedy for her shortcomings, and a rectification of her many oversights and errors. Through art, our human art and science, we can cure diseases, supply want, bring riches and plenty to all of mankind, avoid or at least ameliorate natural disasters, and even resolve the complicated knots of our innermost emotional and psychological strugglings. Indeed, I fear that we are not far from a time when human art in the form of technology will be considered itself superior to nature. Now, that is a novelty of our particular situation today, and it is something that we should be watching for very vigilantly. because this attitude, should it ever become widespread, will certainly be one of the most hazardous that we could possibly adopt. So it would seem from this point of view that the human world and the natural world are drawing further and further apart. But even as this is happening, we see a counter movement to try to make human beings more natural. This in a variety of ways, from the things that they eat to, exercising more regularly, trying to make people healthier by bringing them back to nature, making them go out in the natural world more regularly. But this also means on a deeper level that we should be less artificial and constructed, more authentic to ourselves. And this often is taken to implicate that we should be closer to our animal natures. We're encouraged to a variety of animal pleasures. Being more natural means being more hedonistic in many cases. It means being more sexual. And this is the snag that the modern view comes up against constantly, if often only tacit. Human beings are somehow taken to stand outside the natural order, but they also carry that natural order within themselves. Human beings are beings of a specific nature. Now, when we hear talk of human nature in contemporary times, it often comes with a cynical overtone. Human nature is what takes over when human beings become rapacious, greedy, violent, and warlike. And here again, nature is subtly contrasted, unfavorably, against the works of science and progress. And in this respect, the animal in man is actually often denigrated. It's as if we have to become less and less natural the better we want to be. Morality is detached completely from nature, and it's unclear exactly what it's supposed to be resting on. This is the drama of our contemporary morality. What in the world is it standing on? Is it standing on anything at all? Is it hovering over an abyss? Why do we think some things are better than other things? Just because we like to? Well, we all know how long that can last. Now, there's another strand of modernity which actually follows the ancient model, taking nature as a normative standard, but on modern presuppositions. It agrees that nature, and specifically human nature, suggests a proper way of acting in the world. But the ought that it derives from this is radically different from the ancient ought. It looks at human beings as the product of an evolutionary process, the children of a kind of long evolutionary war. And in accordance with this, human beings, if they want to act in accordance with their nature, must become violent and aggressive and ruthless beasts. One sees this presented very starkly in Jack London, for instance, in places like Wild Fang and The Sea Wolf. Despite being conflicted about this idea, London was very drawn to it, and he had lived through a number of experiences which permitted him to see with a great deal of clarity exactly what this meant in practice. This is also present very much in Nietzsche's idea of the blonde beast of prey, and consequently, although only in a very qualified way, in his idea of the overman. There is a violence, a mercilessness, a power inherent to this idea of the human being, and it has led to astounding travesties in the modern period. So much for the idea of the nature of the human being as such. But obviously this idea has a great many difficulties inherent to it, and one of the ways that we avoid these difficulties is by denying the notion of human nature altogether. Thus we speak of the nature not of the human being, but of this or that human being. And we often do so in an apologetic tone. It's just his nature, meaning he can't help it. He's built that way. Each person's nature is his own nature. It is not shared with any other human being. It is unique to him. When the ancients spoke of human nature, they meant it as the regulating universal principle of all human beings, by which alone it was possible to establish reasonable laws, expectations, and morals for humankind. Today, the individual's nature is precisely that which excludes him from the general rules, that which makes him irreducibly individual, inherently unassimilable to the laws governing the mass of human beings. In its earliest manifestations, these exceptions are granted only to exceptional human beings. Geniuses, artists, the great men like Napoleon or Julian Sorel or Raskolnikov. Individuals who, because of their innate excellence, cannot be bound to the laws that govern the general run of human beings. But as the democratic mindset takes hold in modernity, this idea is generalized, to the point that every single human being is seen to have an individual nature. And the consequence, of course, is that no law can be established any longer, because each individual must establish a law unto himself. And here relativism comes in with banners flying. A relativism, however, grounded firmly in subjectivism, radical subjectivism. The profoundly anarchical consequences of this view are only spared us thanks to a happy inconsistency, and the lucky fact that this idea is a blatant lie. Most human beings are simply normal human beings. They desire quite naturally to fit in and to follow the trends of their times. The trends of our times are liberal and democratic. And so most people who hold to this view are liberal and democratic. And so we manage to avoid the utter lawlessness that might otherwise result from our absurd views. Still, the tendency that we've been stated is always toward dissolution, chaos, atomization, and these tendencies are only exacerbated by the newest technologies. So, In consequence of this, our avoidance of the social, moral, and political dimension of the problem of nature leads us, in turn and by roundabout routes, to a very specific kind of social, moral, and political outlook. This is inevitable. We human beings cannot possibly get around this kind of thinking. Value neutrality is fundamentally impossible for beings like us, who live and breathe and move through the densest webs of meaning on a constant basis. And we see this emphatically with the idea of nature. The modern idea of nature is supposed to be scientific. It is value neutral. It is impartial. It eschews all aesthetic, teleological, moral, or political implications. And it is secular. But here's the problem. These are impossibilities for any view of the world. Human beings cannot live with an inherently nihilistic view of the cosmos. We are meaning-finding, meaning-bearing beings. And in consequence, all of modernity has been nothing but a succession of reactions against the vacuum at the heart of its very endeavor. Hence, the Romantics brought beauty back into nature. The Transcendentalists brought meaning back into nature. The hippies brought morality back into nature. The social Darwinists and the racialists brought politics back into nature. And all of them, to a one, broke the secular core of it by personifying nature. This personification is more than just a way of speaking. It is more than a mere act of shallow anthropomorphization. It is an acknowledgement that the thing that we are talking about is a real force somewhere in the world, a thing with intentions, a thing that guides its processes through a kind of intelligence, a teleological and intentional being, and a being whose movements affect us all, whether directly or indirectly. We are seeing, in short, the vague outlines of a spirit or a god. But we are both too blinded and too pusillanimous to actually look the existence of the gods in the face, so we would rather be drowned in the consequences of our views without actually bothering to understand them. This is where we come to the urgency of our predicament. We must cease to be passive here. We have to open our eyes. We human beings are surrounded by spiritual realities, spiritual entities on a constant basis. I touched on this as well in my video on experience when I spoke of the old idea of fortuna. Now, even the first Christians acknowledged the existence of these beings. They simply attempted to rectify the errors with regard to them. They changed the perspective about the gods. They put the gods in their right place. We, on the other hand, want to deny these existences altogether, and that's bound to do nothing but get us into trouble. We see here how each of the successive waves of modernity has been infused with errors owing to the limitations of the false principles of modernity itself. And this is where our work comes in. We have to understand those principles. We have to get to the root of them. We have to find their falseness and to expose it to the light of day. But we cannot be merely reactionary. We cannot merely reject what we as modern human beings have been given. There is something true, if only partial, in the modern view of nature. This cannot be abandoned or forgotten. It's too late for that. Mother Nature, in all of her terrifying ambiguity, her grace and her gorgeousness and her ravening and her ruthlessness, exists among us now and has to be reckoned with. This reckoning cannot come, as should go absolutely without saying, through science. Science refuses to acknowledge the necessity or the existence of meaning. It is in this respect proudly nihilistic, hubristically nihilistic. And so this reckoning can only come through those activities which are intimately connected to meaning. It can only come through art, philosophy, and a reintegration of all of this into a theologically sound view of the world. We have to learn to live again in that medium for which we were born and built, the medium of meaning. That, my friends, is our nature as human beings, and consequently, it is our calling. So in this video and in the last one, I've touched on the cultural dilemma of our times, how to approach the problem of culture, how to approach the problem of philosophy in a time which has lost its bearings in both of these fields. And I'll definitely have more to say about that in the future. I hope at least that all of this has served as a kind of premise, however, to that future work, a kind of critical anticipation of the more constructive work to come. As always, I crave your thoughts. Please, if you'd like to, leave me a message about any of this, leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about the problem of nature, about anything that I've said. If you think it's all nonsense and I should probably just be abandoned in the forest and left to the wolves, then let me know that as well. Leave a like on my video every now and then, if you feel the urge. And please subscribe to my channel. These are small things, but I can assure you, from the solitude of my room, they actually mean a great deal. So remember also to follow me on Substack, where the serialization of my Western novel proceeds apace. I want to thank you all for joining me as always. Your support, your presence means a great deal to me. I would not be here without it, I can assure you that. So I'm wishing you all a very pleasant spring. I hope that Mother Nature is generous with you all this spring and reveals her abundance and her beauties rather than her other aspects. And until next time, farewell to you all.